we're excited about is, how do you turn these static systems of record into kinetic systems, right? How do you facilitate data movement and work to happen between these systems that don't talk to each other, by developing, AI models and tools that are able to kind of bridge that gap, right? And the way that gap is bridged today is, you have a human log in to a computer, pull both these applications up, click around and do a task repeatedly. But there's no reason why, these models can't do that. And I think, as we show in a lot of our research during the PhD, they're getting to the point where, they're actually, pretty capable of doing a lot of these tasks. And so I think kind of the grand vision for what we're building towards is, building these kind of general purpose agents specifically for healthcare, since obviously that's, what I'm passionate about and where I think, the most meaningful impact is, and really kind of laying the groundwork, the infrastructure, the platform for, building what, I would call, a self-driving hospital, right? Where it's, you see the doctor, you get your care, and then everything kind of happens in the background magically. That's the vision that we're excited about at Kinetic Systems.
So let's just go ahead and get started with your background. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, yeah, first, again, thank you for having me on. My name is Michael. I just wrapped up a PhD at Stanford in computer science, co-advised by Chris Ray on the ML side and Nigam Shah on the healthcare side. And broadly, my research was focused on how do we improve care delivery within the hospital setting for both patients and providers. So a combination of improving clinical decision-making with foundation models, as well as automating end-to-end workflows that providers and administrators in the hospital do. I just graduated in June and recently spun out a company to focus on commercializing this research.
Awesome. So beyond that, maybe tell us a little bit about kind of how you first got interested in computer science.
Yeah, that's a good question. Originally, growing up in the Bay, an incredible privilege. There's a lot of great, research and national labs, in your backyard. And so my first kind of introduction to computer science was actually attending a public lecture by a professor named Jay Kiesling, who was at the Joint Bioenergy Institute in Emeryville at the time, doing really cool work in genetics and biofuels and climate change. And I was, very fascinated by kind of the combination of those fields. And also at the time was, getting interested in, building websites and, playing around on the computer and stuff. And was fortunate enough to, attend this lecture, got really inspired by it, reached out to the lab and got connected with a few really, really smart and generous folks there who decided to basically take me under the wing and let me kind of poke around the lab for a summer and learn more about the stuff that they were doing, which was bioinformatics, the intersection of genetics and computer science. And so that was kind of my first kind of foray into the world, kind of through my interest in biology and genetics. And, just so happened that the folks I got connected with were on the computational side. And I really loved that experience, learned a lot. And, after that, just kind of continued to get into the world of bioinformatics and computational biology. So I ended up in college studying computer science and statistics, but always kind of through the lens of biology and genetics and genomics. So in college, I ended up spending time doing research at the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard, doing work in David Liu's lab, who does a lot of great work in CRISPR and genetic engineering. And then coming to grad school at Stanford, thought I was going to do very similar stuff. So I spent the first year and a half also working in the computational biology space, and trying to understand, how do we accelerate drug discovery with computer science and machine learning. But during the PhD, ended up drifting a little bit away from kind of the beginning stages of, how do we get drugs to patients, which is, the microbiology, the wet lab portion of it, and more towards the actual delivery of the drugs to end patients. So, assuming we have, a drug that someone's discovered in a lab, how do we actually get that in the hands of a patient and a provider, and how do we actually deliver care to patients? During the PhD, kind of drifted from drug discovery part to more of the clinical trial and operations part. And then eventually, after aligning with Nigam, who's the chief data scientist of Stanford Hospital, ended up focusing during my PhD much more on the clinical side of healthcare. The drugs that we do discover, how do we actually give them to patients and improve the accessibility and affordability of those treatments. So started much more on the drug discovery side, but ended up finding a lot of interesting problems to pick at on the clinical side. And I think it's an area that within the world of computer science, it's a little bit underappreciated or understudied relative to all the excitement around drug discovery and protein modeling and stuff like that. And so that was where I ended up finding a home during the PhD, and was really fortunate to find really, really smart collaborators at Stanford to work with.
Awesome. So like sort of kind of like you mentioned, right? You had a bit of a transition throughout your PhD, and so maybe we can start with the kind of a few papers that you worked on that were pretty exciting. So you had a paper titled sort of EHR shot or maybe earshot, and then you had another paper sort of titled context clues. And I think both of these were kind of in maybe similar categories where I think, context clues was focused on evaluating long context models for clinical prediction tasks on EHRs. And then, EHR shot, for instance, was focused on kind of an EHR benchmark for few shot evaluation of foundation models. Later on in your PhD, I mean, we can get to this, but you kind of switched, your focus to maybe a little bit more focused on like automating the enterprise of foundation models and things like this. But for kind of your first focus, maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of these papers, your journey working on them, maybe some key insights or key results from those papers, and then kind of what motivated the transition.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So maybe just to put a little bit of context to the listener. So I'd say there were kind of two kind of buckets of research that are the PhD ended up falling into. The first bucket of stuff that we looked at was how do we improve the individual point decisions that doctors make? So, how do we improve clinical decision making? And that research was very much focused on training foundation models on electronic health record data to predict future events that will happen to a patient. So, will you get readmitted in 30 days? How long will your length of stay be in a hospital? Will you get diagnosed with cancer in the next year? Will this lab test come back abnormally? Stuff like that. And then, as you hinted at, the second half of our research, or the focus of my PhD, was great. We can improve individual point decisions within the hospital, but individual decisions are individual decisions, right? They're one piece of much larger workflows that have to happen end to end in order for patients to receive care. And so the second half of work that we looked at, the second half of stuff that we looked at in our research work was how do we automate end-to-end workflows rather than improving just the individual decisions made within that workflow. So to answer your question, so the first half of research work that we did with earshot and context clues and some other work that came out of Nigam's lab was, there's this great, new kind of approach or paradigm with foundation models, right? You throw a bunch of data in, the model is able to, learn at scale patterns from unlabeled data, and then basically, spit out representations that are then useful for a wide range of downstream tasks. And, in the field of healthcare, with just like, other fields, before foundation models came, like NLP and computer vision, right? You'd have a ton of, models that were trained for very specific tasks, right? So you might have one ML model for predicting sepsis. You might have another ML model for predicting PAD. You might have another ML model for predicting, mortality, right? And so, as a hospital, or a university, right, you might have 30 different random models trained on 30 different groups of data of, 30 different kind of evaluation setups and 30 different PIs running these models and 30 different servers somewhere, sitting at the hospital. And so, it's just a mess, basically. Like, it's hard to maintain, it's hard to track, it's hard to monitor, but also on the prediction side, it's hard to, make sure that, everyone is, training on, the right data, there's no leakage, you're evaluating the right way. It's hard to do that for one model, let alone 30 different models across 30 labs. And the performance also, would be folks would struggle to get sufficient performance given for each individual task they were looking at. There were only so many labeled examples that exist in a hospital, right? Like if you're trying to predict pancreatic cancer, for example, there's only so many people with pancreatic cancer that you can train a model on. So that was kind of the state of the field. And obviously, this is, not unique to healthcare, but healthcare kind of lags the rest of the world when it comes to, technological adoption. And so credit to a lot of collaborators in my lab, like Jason, Ethan, and other folks that came through Nigam's lab, where, they saw all this excitement around foundation models and around, natural language processing and images. And the question was, can we apply this machinery to healthcare? And kind of the core insight here is, you might have a certain disease, I might have a different disease, but at the end of the day, we all share the same basic human physiology. And so by learning from your disease trajectory, your medical history, I can learn patterns just like, the syntax of language when it comes to, English or, natural language. And those patterns of disease trajectory will also apply to patient X, Y, or Z, even if they have very different, disease profiles and come from very different backgrounds, because, at the end of the day, we're all humans. And so that's kind of the core motivation for why the foundation model approach makes a lot of sense in the healthcare setting of doing clinical prediction making. And that was kind of a core motivation for the earshot and context clues works, which were, one, can we rigorously benchmark and evaluate these foundation models on these sorts of tasks and this sort of data? And then two, with context clues, how do certain characteristics of a model, for example, its context length, impact our ability to make better clinical predictions? And so, what we ended up, finding in the paper, which, is not much of a surprise to folks, is that, yes, training a foundation model on 2.5 million unlabeled patient trajectories, and then fine-tuning it or translating it to a very specific use case, like I mentioned, like pancreatic cancer prediction. That foundation model ends up outperforming a model trained just on pancreatic patients, even if it's seen hundreds more labeled examples of pancreatic cancer patients, right? And so with the kind of general approach that we have with these models is we basically take a patient, we look at their medical history, specifically what's called structured codes, so like diagnoses, medications, lab test results, and we basically serialize this into a sequence of tokens, right? Just like language. And so, the equivalent of, a sentence in healthcare is, a visit to a hospital or, a stay in the ICU. And each word or token in your sentence is, you're diagnosed with this, you were prescribed this medication, you had this lab test taken, et cetera, et cetera. And so, it's very natural then to, just take the machinery of the broader, world of transformers and, foundation models, et cetera, and, apply it to these problems in healthcare, because the data basically looks the same if you tokenize it or you serialize it or you think about it in terms of, a chronological timeline of events that are happening to a patient. So that's kind of how we do that translation. And yeah, I think what was really exciting about that work is there had been a lot of excitement in the literature about using these models, but there had been a bit of a reproducibility crisis since healthcare data is very hard to share. There's not a lot of great benchmarks out there, and there's not really like a Hugging Face equivalent for these models yet. And so with Earshot, we were hoping that would be kind of a first step in that direction, and obviously followed it up with a few other papers. And there are now larger efforts like the Medical Event Data Standard, or MEDS, which is now a pretty large consortium of folks across dozens of different institutions trying to build that shared ML infrastructure for the healthcare space. And so that was kind of the inspiration for a lot of that work, and I'm very excited to see other folks continue to build on that, and hopefully start deploying these things into production at hospitals to do all sorts of prediction making and improving clinical outcomes for patients.
Awesome. And kind of continuing on, kind of like we hinted out, there's two papers that you kind of worked on towards the end of your PhD that are kind of more focused on, okay, we have these, maybe multimodal foundation models. How do we actually apply them to these like business process management tasks, actually in real sort of workflows for these large enterprises? So let's go ahead and start with your first paper that I thought was super exciting here, and it's titled Wonder Bread, the benchmark for evaluating multimodal foundation models on business process management tasks. So there's a lot of interesting stuff you guys do in this paper, but I think kind of the key result as I see it is that you guys are building this like benchmark. In fact, I think it's kind of like the first benchmark for evaluating multimodal models on common process mining tasks. And I think you guys had like a little over 2,900 different like human demonstrations across like videos, images, and text. And so there's a lot of like sort of exciting stuff about this. I think traditionally it's like a lot of these like BPM tasks have been overlooked by existing benchmarks. So I guess maybe tell us a little bit about kind of why they've been overlooked, why this benchmark is kind of the first, and kind of what the end downstream implications of this are on like practical things. And I also think there are some interesting insights here with like I think you guys talk about like some tasks do well, but other tasks are not done well. And like this benchmark shows that like you can kind of like weed out certain behavior and where like it like the behavior is good at a certain thing but is maybe not great at the entire benchmark. So maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of like what you found models to be good at, like GPT-4. I think you guys were talking about in the paper versus not good at.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it's things have progressed a lot since we put it out, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and so I'm sure the models are even better at all these things now. But to answer your original question, yeah, why did we write this paper? Um, the so the two papers you mentioned, there's one called Automating the Enterprise with Foundation Models, in which we kind of proposed a framework called Eclair, which was basically like, how do you think about automation through the lens of vision language models? And the kind of counter positioning of the paper is a technology called robotic process automation, or RPA, right? Which is kind of the first generation of tools that folks would use to automate repetitive tasks. And at its core, RPA is basically like a low code or no code tool where you drag and drop different elements into some sort of DAG, and then you execute some deterministic workflow. And popular software solutions are things like UiPath or Automation Anywhere, et cetera. And so we started writing that paper first, and one of the core motivations was coming out of your first question of all the clinical decision making work we had done. I spent a lot of time talking to doctors and nurses and folks on the clinical side through some of my work with the applied data science team at Stanford Hospital. And the one thing that kept coming up was, this is super cool, this is interesting, that's great research, but what really is grinding my gears is the fact that after I leave the hospital, I have to spend 2 hours every night clicking through Epic, which is the electronic health record we have, to do a bunch of paperwork and basically administrative stuff, right? And so the pain point that I heard was less of I want X% better prediction on what this lab test will come back at. That's the part of the job I enjoy. What I actually want you to focus on is automating kind of the bullshit paperwork basically that I have to slog through every day. So that was kind of the original motivation behind the Wonder Bread work and the Eclair work. And so we started the Eclair work, and our focus was initially, okay, great, there are these tasks, let's automate them, right? So great, okay, let's think about how to do workflow automation with vision language models. And as part of that work, one of the things that we're fortunate to be at Stanford, which obviously has a hospital on campus, and have great advisors like Nigam and Chris who are very supportive of this project, was I'm actually just going to go to the hospital, recruit a bunch of nurses, and literally record what they do in a sandbox version of Epic to understand what are the workflows that they want us to automate. And what I quickly learned through that process was a lot of times people don't even know the workflow that they want automated, or maybe they do, but the workflow that they're doing is actually totally different from someone else in the same department nominally doing the same workflow, but totally different set of steps. And so like, ironically, the thing that hits you is like, well, to automate a workflow, like first you got to know what workflow you're automating, right? And a lot of people skip past that very first step of understanding like what are we actually doing, what is the problem that we're solving, right? And so that was, to answer your question, kind of the original motivation with the Wonder Bread paper, which was, hey, there's all these great benchmarks out there, like OS World and Web Arena, et cetera, for automating tasks using agents. But what are these tasks? They're kind of made up, right? It's like click around on an e-commerce website, or like fill out this order form, or stuff like that. Like they're fairly contrived. And when we started talking to folks at the actual hospital, the learning was actually like even just understanding the work that we do today, like independent of automating it, is actually tremendously valuable to us, right? Like we don't even we lack documentation. There's a lot of tribal knowledge is kind of the term that I've heard thrown around a lot, or tacit knowledge, right? Which is in someone's head, and they do it every day, but it's never written down. It's hard to explain to someone unless they just watch what you do day over day. And so capturing or trying to understand, can we use these technologies not just to automate work, but to help us understand how we do work today, was a big kind of motivating research question for the Wonder Bread work. And so just to kind of give a little bit of sense of what we did then, it was basically taking vision language models and using them to do a variety of what I would call business process management tasks. Things like, hey, here's a screen recording of someone doing work, generate the standard operating procedure, like write down all the steps of what this person is doing, right? Or another example would be, here's two different demonstrations of the same workflow. Explain to me, the similarities and differences between them, and which one is more efficient, right? What are the best practices? Or another one could be, here's a set of demonstrations. I'm a new person coming onto the team, being trained. I have a question about how to do something. Can the model answer a semantic question about the workflow, like what is the step that comes after this, or why do we do this button click or whatever? Can the model handle that? And so what we did in this benchmark, as you mentioned, is basically put together, I think, like roughly 3,000-ish demonstrations of different workflows for different tasks, based on the Web Arena data set that I mentioned before. And so all of it's publicly available. And we just basically benchmarked a bunch of different frontier models on their abilities to do these sorts of tasks. And I think kind of the conclusion was, they're not perfect, but they're actually pretty strong on a pretty wide range of these tasks. And thinking about that workflow understanding piece as kind of the first step towards then using these models to actually automate like real economically valuable work. I came away feeling very optimistic about that. And I think, that is kind of one of the challenges with a lot of these automation projects, which, we're also encountering with the company that we're building right now is, there's no such thing as like the perfect workflow that's already perfectly documented, that like, they'll just hand you the specification and it's just you just have to turn it into code. Like there's always a lot of, knowledge transfer and, elicitation of that sort of information that does require you to like roll up your sleeves and do it yourself. And what we found was, actually the models are great at that too. And so you can imagine, really kind of this end-to-end kind of automation pipeline where not only is it automating the actual workflow and executing it, but it's also understanding, what is it that needs to be done and how is it done today. So that was kind of the motivation for the Wonder Red work. And then just to kind of close the loop on that, the automating the enterprise work, proposed this, framework called Declare, which basically kind of stitches together, these different components of, how you would actually deploy this into practice, starting with, how do you demonstrate or specify the workflow, then how do you execute it, and then finally, how do you validate it? And again, here we experimented with using vision language models at each step of that pipeline to avoid some of the pitfalls or limitations of traditional RPA technology, right? Which was difficult to set up. It was brittle when interfaces changed. A button moved over 5 pixels, you had to rewire your script. Obviously, the nice thing about vision language models is, they can do a little bit more semantic understanding of the screen. And then the last piece we looked at was the validation piece, the maintenance piece, right? Like usually with these RPA scripts, you got to have a person come in and fix them when they break. But, there's no reason why a vision language model or just an LLM period couldn't watch a workflow fail to execute or notice an exception and then use it to, self-repair or self-heal. And so those were a lot of the capabilities we were very excited about, and what we're focused on now productionizing through the lens of our company.
Awesome. And I think that's where it brings us to kind of, what you're working on right now. So maybe tell us a little bit about Kinetic. Tell us a little about kind of the founding story, the decision to found Kinetic as opposed to go work at maybe another enterprise. And yeah, kind of like what do you think makes you different from all the other RPA companies?
Yeah. Yeah, as I've kind of alluded to, I'm a co-founder of a company called Kinetic Systems, and our vision or our mission is to build the infrastructure for the self-driving hospital of the future. Okay, great. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean for a hospital to be self-driving? Basically, if you've looked at the growth of different types of jobs in the healthcare space over the last several decades, and you plotted it on a graph, right? You'd have clinicians as a little orange sliver kind of at the bottom of this graph, and then administrators, a huge explode like this. If you imagine like just this huge blue chunk that just gets bigger and bigger over time, and for every doctor you see at a hospital, there's like 10 or 20 or 30 people sitting in the basement of the hospital doing paperwork to enable those clinicians to actually deliver care to patients, right? To actually deliver the product. And we see this borne out on a macro scale with our economy, and of the $4 or $5 trillion that we spend on healthcare every year in the U.S., roughly $1 trillion of that goes to administrative overhead or waste, right? And so that's time, resources, and attention that's being diverted away from patient care towards basically pushing paper around, right? And not only is there an economic cost to this, but there's a patient cost too. There's a study a while ago in BMJ that found that preventable medical error was the number 3 leading cause of death in the U.S., right? And that's like something no one thinks about. We don't really measure it. I mean, it's hard to measure, obviously. But if you've walked around a hospital or shadowed someone, or you are a clinician, that a lot of things are kind of just hanging by a thread, right? Whether it's someone mistyping a dosage into the EHR, or misprescribing something, or missing it, or not placing an order in time for a patient to get discharged before the weekend. Like, there's all these like small administrative things which on their own don't feel like much, but at the scale of a health system add up, and impact patients quite directly. Like, a good example that I give is ordering durable medical equipment. So like ordering a wheelchair. I forget the exact details, but it was something like if you didn't place this order for a wheelchair by noon, they couldn't fill it until the next day. And so let's say it's Friday and you don't fill this order by noon. Filling the order is just like downloading PDFs and e-faxing it to the wheelchair supplier. Well, it doesn't open again until Monday. And so now if you're a patient and, you're sitting in the hospital, instead of getting discharged at Friday, now you got to wait till Monday. Right. And, it might not seem like much, but, being in a hospital is not a great place to be stuck. And obviously it opens you up to, a host of, issues and complications and infections and whatever, but also just from a patient experience, it's, not ideal. And so that's, a very small example of something that I would conceive of as, purely administrative, right? Like downloading PDFs and faxing them to a wheelchair provider and clearing that with insurance, not clinical in any way, but it has an actual, patient impact, right? And there's hundreds of these examples in hospitals. So those are, that kind of huge kind of distribution of problems, I think is pretty pervasive. What, we're very excited about at Kinetic Systems is thinking about how do we use the technologies that, we looked at in the PhD, vision language models, computer use agents, et cetera. How do we use this to help streamline and automate a lot of these administrative tasks that both have an economic cost, but also a care delivery and patient outcome cost. And so concretely, like what we're working on from the technology side is building reliable computer use agents to automate administrative workflows for healthcare providers. And the kind of core insight here is that a lot of administrative tasks in a hospital are what I call 2-screen workflows. Like basically you have a system of record here on one half of your screen, and then another system of record on the other half of your screen. Usually this is like your EHR, like Epic, and the other half could be, a payer portal, it could be a clearinghouse, it could be a state clinical registry you're reporting to. It could be, a specialty lab diagnostic provider. It could be a DME provider. It could be anything, right? And, let's say 80% or, the vast majority of admin work at a hospital is basically moving data between these systems that don't talk to each other, right? These static systems of record. And, that's a problem, right? And a ton of time and attention is wasted because these systems just, don't talk to each other and they don't integrate. And so kind of the inspiration for, the company and the name and, what we're excited about is, how do you turn these static systems of record into kinetic systems, right? How do you facilitate data movement and work to happen between these systems that don't talk to each other by developing, AI models and tools that are able to kind of bridge that gap, right? And, the way that that gap is bridged today is, you have a human log in to a computer, pull both these applications up, click around and do a task repeatedly. But there's no reason why, these models can't do that. And I think as, we show in a lot of our research during the PhD, they're getting to the point where, they're actually, pretty capable of doing a lot of these tasks. And so I think kind of the grand vision for what we're building towards is, building these kind of general purpose agents specifically for healthcare, since obviously that's, what I'm passionate about and where I think, the most meaningful impact is, and really kind of laying the groundwork, the infrastructure, the platform for, building what, I would call, a self-driving hospital, right? Where it's, you see the doctor, you get your care, and then everything kind of happens in the background magically. That's the vision that we're excited about at Kinetic Systems.
Awesome. So, two questions here, just to dig a little bit deeper. So, first is there are a lot of other people doing similar things, right? There's like Collate that's trying to do something similar, maybe kind of with like document processing workflows. There's Latent Health, which is also kind of maybe doing something slightly similar. Like you sort of hinted at, there's UiPath. There's Sola Solutions that are doing kind of more broadly RPA. So, I guess the first question there is like, why isn't anybody else doing computer use agents, or like kind of what do you think your competitive edge is there? The second is the sales cycle for large enterprise organizations in healthcare is extremely long. So it takes a while to not only generate revenue, but also to prove yourself through a strong design partnership. So maybe tell us a little bit about kind of like the challenges of selling slash like how you guys have gone through that process.
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe start with the first question about kind of the competitive space and the market dynamics. So I think, yeah, broadly, I think there's a lot of attention on computer use right now. There's a lot of attention on RPA. I'd say, like, personally, I have yet to see uh, a very, I have yet to see a winning product within the healthcare vertical. And I think there's a lot of value to being, domain specific and vertical specific, given just, the interfaces that you'll see and you'll specialize in. I think, kind of the short answer is like, I don't think computer use is quite there. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think anything you can do to constrain the problem helps. It's not sufficient to be kind of 80%-ish accurate on some of these tasks. Like you have to really solve them if a hospital is going to trust you to deploy it. And so that's kind of the bet we're making is, given kind of my background and the work that we've done, really zeroing in on, the healthcare space, the several interfaces that matter most to healthcare providers and hospitals. That's what we're going to really specialize in. That's what we're going to crush. And that's kind of how we're going to differentiate from the rest of kind of the general, either vertical agnostic or, computer use agents and other verticals from those sorts of folks. And I'd say, I know you mentioned Layton. There's a lot of other really awesome folks as well working in kind of the back office automation space in healthcare, and very familiar with the team. I'd say like the computer use part, I haven't quite seen anyone execute, to the finish line yet. I think there's a lot of technical work to be done. And I think kind of the approach we're taking that I think is different is rather than us coming in and, changing a workflow that you might already do as a hospital or setting up another system, another, portal or point solution to log into. What we're most excited about is like, how do you form fit this technology on the way that work is already done at a hospital today, right? Like, how do you do this in a way that doesn't require folks to change the work they do or to download another point solution? Like, we're very interested in being kind of that interstitial tissue between systems that hospitals and providers already have. And so that's kind of how I think about what we're doing versus folks who are specialized in, like latent, 340B specialty pharma, or, other folks who target different parts of the revenue cycle or patient intake process. We're more interested in building kind of that general platform using computer use as a primitive to, connect systems that don't talk to each other. So that's kind of how I think about where there's a big gap in the market today. And again, right, like you talk to any hospital or health system, right, like, there's almost no mention of computer use, let alone, even, initial thoughts of, let's pilot this technology. Like it's pretty, I guess to also kind of get to your second question, like, there is a pretty big lag between, what you see on Hacker News and what you see in other industries and what you're seeing in healthcare. And so the conversations that I have with folks are actually basically starting from square zero. It's like, what is this technology? What does it do? Can you explain to me, like, why, what are the limitations and what are the strengths of this tool? And really the comparison point that we hit a lot is humans versus the computer use agent rather than computer use agent versus another computer use agent, since I think we're still in early innings, and really there hasn't quite been a product that reaches the level of reliability where I would say some of these buyers would actually consider using it. So I think like there's a pretty big like technical hurdle that still needs to be cleared for a lot of this stuff, and obviously that's what we're very focused on from the research side. I think it helps to constrain it to a vertical, because now the set of interfaces you need to be looking at, and it's a little bit less of a daunting technical challenge than pre-training something from scratch that will solve every single workflow that exists in the economy. So I think that domain specificity helps a lot. And then I'd say, yeah, the conversations with folks so far have been really productive. Again, it's been a lot of education, since it's pretty new to a lot of these buyers, and I think people still don't quite understand like what does it mean to build a truly reliable and useful computer use agent for healthcare workflows, rather than another point solution for a specific part of my revenue cycle or my patient intake flow. And so I think that kind of more platformy play is definitely takes a longer conversation, but through the help of my advisors and a great team of investors that we have around the table, we've been able to push a lot of those conversations forward, and are excited to start piloting with folks, and actually get this stuff in the hands of end users. So not gonna lie, healthcare is a slog. It's taken a while, but I think if you're able to penetrate that part of the market and actually prove value, I think there's a huge opportunity ahead, and it's something that again, in just conversations with customers, like I don't see a lot of people making a ton of headway in, not for lack of trying, but I think there is definitely a lot of great technical work to be done, and also a lot of interesting work on the go-to-market side as well, which we're very excited to be doing.
Awesome. And our very last question, because we're pretty much at time here. Tell us a little bit about kind of the founding team, size of the team, who you're looking to hire, what the people that you're looking to hire should self-select into, aka what sort of quantitative, qualitative characteristics you want, what characteristics of their personal qualities, the way that they act, the way that they operate, their experience you're looking for, and why they should join you as opposed to joining Latent or Collate or Sola or any of the other startups.
Yeah, you ask great questions. I love the detail. Hopefully I can remember all the sub questions, but I'd say generally, so kind of what is the team right now? Basically, a handful of folks from Stanford that I knew through my lab work and PhD research. So both my advisors are involved in the company, and then we have a great set of investors around as well. So very early, we're looking to basically scale out the engineering team within the next few weeks or months, to hit roughly, hopefully, 10 folks within the next couple months, and deliver some of the product that we have early potential clients who are very excited about. So a lot of product development ahead, I guess, is the short answer. What are kind of the profiles we're looking at? Mostly, folks interested in, I guess, mainly this kind of computer use piece, I think, is kind of the biggest thing. So folks interested in, applied AI, machine learning engineering, et cetera, AI research as well. Folks who are interested as well, hopefully, in kind of the healthcare piece. I think it's obviously very rewarding and meaningful, but it is there is definitely a little bit more friction with this vertical than others, and so you have to be excited and energized by that. And then the last piece is just folks who are excited to join an early team, who are excited to really shape the journey from the start, and who are hungry and excited to be part of a very talent dense group of folks who are really excited about building the next $1 trillion company within the healthcare space, and actually meaningfully move the needle on patient care and provider satisfaction. And I think that last piece is the biggest piece. Like, I think the vision, like the goal of our company is not to like, I guess, you guys kind of versus other companies in the space and folks doing, workflow automation in healthcare, like, our vision is not to, hyper optimize like, a sub niche workflow or build another point solution. Again, I think all that has merit, and there's point solutions for a reason. Like, there's definitely a lot of value in it, but I don't think that's necessarily what excites me the most, and what I think actually will move the needle for our healthcare system. We're spending $1 trillion on administrative waste every year. Like, you need to take a more fundamental rethink of how we approach and solve these problems. Like, what really excites me is, okay, can we take this interesting kernel of technology, computer use, which is fairly general purpose. It's any two screens basically, which is I would consider the vast majority of admin work. And can you use that technical nugget to actually move the needle on making healthcare more accessible and affordable in the country? And so like the core of our thesis is we're going to build kind of this more general purpose, unified way of solving these workflows, and then we're going to apply them to as many problems and use cases as we can, and really take a big swing and try to move the needle, rather than hey, we'll be another point solution for this very specific part of this specific sub workflow. So if you're excited about that, if you're excited about really taking a swing and trying to move the needle on making healthcare in the U.S. more affordable, efficient, and accessible, those are the types of folks who we're very excited to work with and would be eager to have a conversation with about joining us at Kinetic Systems.
Awesome. And we will definitely have Michael's email in the description, so make sure to go email him and reach out in any form if you're interested. Yeah, Michael's amazing. He's done a lot of really amazing stuff. This conversation is just the tip of the iceberg. So if you're interested in that mission, definitely go talk to him. Awesome. Well, without further ado, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Really appreciate the Delta Institute for having me, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.